Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 6. Today we'll discuss revision strategies with a focus on organization. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for the lecture assignment. You'll need access to your Project 1 rough draft, as well as access to your Week 3 homework document. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll understand organization as a global revision concern. We'll understand organization as a means for ensuring a supported writing, and we'll understand organization as a means for assessing coherency. All right, organization as revision. When we hear the term revision, oftentimes our minds will go to performing line edits or finding the misspelled words or the misplaced commas, things of that sort. And while those considerations are a part of the revision process, they're not the only thing that we want to keep an eye out for. We also want to be aware of how we're supporting our writing, how we're organizing our writing, the tone that we use when trying to inform or convince our audience of something. So when we think of organization, the first thing that we want to be aware of is that it is a global revision as opposed to a local revision. Now, what's the difference between those terms? When we think of global revision, those are changes that we make to the document that can impact the writing as a whole. So for example, if you decide to say, okay, well, I want to put this point first. I want to reorganize my material to where I talk about ethos first as opposed to logos. That's going to require that you go through the document and that your organization reflects the fact that you have switched the ways in which you are talking about those two rhetorical tactics. We can also think about it in terms of, let's say tone. Let's say you're writing for a completely different audience. Tone is another global concern that we'll look at later through the semester. If you say, okay, well, initially I wrote this for my English 2010 class, but now I think I could very easily present this to the members of my neighborhood watch, or I could present this to members of the school board, or to, whoever it is that I want to persuade for my argument. So if we decide to change tone, and we say, okay, I'm going from an academic audience to more of a political audience, that's going to change the type of words that you use, the way that you structure your content, the ways in which you appeal to the different artistic proofs. So that's going to change your entire document. On the other hand, we have local revision. So that's going through and finding the misspelled words, finding the sentence fragments, finding the misplaced commas, things of that sort. We consider those local revisions because changing a comma splice to a compound sentence really only impacts that sentence, or maybe one or two sentences around it. Rather, if I decide to change a comma splice and make it a compound sentence, it isn't going to impact the ways in which my readers overall understand and respond to the document. Rather, it just impacts the local part of that text. So changes in organizations can result in major changes for the overall document. Like I said, if you decide to say, okay, well, I want to talk about pathos first. I used to have pathos last, but now I want to talk about it first. So let's say you make that switch and you copy and paste your pathos section and you put it at the very top of your analysis. Well, then that means you have to go through and in your pathos section and remove instances of perhaps where you talk about logos and ethos. So maybe you say in your pathos section, as I mentioned earlier when discussing logos, well, you can't really do that anymore because you haven't talked about logos yet in how you have reorganized your content. So since you're talking about pathos first, your reader has no idea what you've said about logos because you haven't talked about logos yet. And so you want to be aware of that. And as well as, let's say in your logo section, you're building up to pathos. You are really using language in a way that says, yeah, I'm leading you to the brilliance. I have that I have written about when it comes to pathos. Okay, well, if you're putting pathos before logos at this point, then that also requires you to go through your logos section and say, well, if logos is now the last thing that I talk about, or I need to use logos to build into ethos, then I obviously need to go through and make the necessary changes. So we can see how changing our organization can result in great changes throughout the rest of our document. Now, organization can be used as a rhetorical tool. I remember in high school when we were talking about the traditional 5-paragraph essay, there was often this idea that you wanted to put your second most important point first, your least important point second, and your most important point first to drive it home and to drive your argument home. That is a way to demonstrate, or that's an illustration of how organization is rhetorical. You want to rope in your audience with something that's as important that will get their attention right from the very beginning. Then, you assume that there's sort of a 7-minute lull type with their reading where they're engaged, but perhaps they're not as interested, and that's where you can put the least important stuff. And then as you drive home, as you make your conclusion, you want to put that most important point first, so that way they remember it. They remember your argument. They remember why they should accept your argument. So we can see, and obviously how we would go about that would change from one audience to the next. So even though this is sort of a dated and kind of antiquated way of understanding organization as rhetorical, I think it still illustrates the point. Now, we of course will not be doing a lot of 5-paragraph essay writing in this course, but it is something to be aware of as we start constructing longer pieces, is how can I use organization to emphasize and to support the argument that I want to convince my audience of. Let's now consider methods and strategies for revising for organization. So first and foremost, we want to analyze the materials that we're revising. First thing that we want to do then will be to identify the purpose of the writing. So remember when we talked about the rhetorical situation, purpose was something that we really took time considering and evaluating. So why is the writer writing? Well, when we revise for organization, the first thing we want to ask ourselves is to say, okay, well, why am I writing? What is the purpose of this? For what reason am I writing on this topic and in this manner? So for example, for project one, the purpose of your writing is to analyze a specific artifact. Maybe in another class, your purpose for writing is to present the results of your research. Perhaps in a more public setting, your purpose is to persuade for a policy change. So you really want to be aware of what your purpose is, because the purpose of your writing is the driving force of your writing. You think about it. When you say, my purpose for writing is to analyze this artifact, that makes you say, okay, well, does my organization reflect that purpose? The next thing that you want to do once you've established that purpose for the document in its entirety, you want to determine the focus of each paragraph. You want to think critically about its role in your work. So as you go through, you want to answer each question to say, why did I include this paragraph? Why is it necessary for me to write this content and to have my reader read it? You also want to say, okay, well, what does this paragraph do that the others don't? And how does it go back to helping me achieve the purpose that I have set forth for this piece of writing? And then you also want to think critically, why did you include this paragraph in the place that you did? And oftentimes that comes back to, okay, well, in order for my audience to understand this point, they have to know this information first before they can understand this information. So again, you can start to see that with these questions in mind, how organization very much is a global concern, because how you organize your writing will influence how your audience understands the content. Third, we want to think critically about the audience, or the people reading our work, the people who we want to engage with our material and hopefully act on our material. So we want to think about how they perceive organization. So some questions to help us get at that would be, how would they prefer to see the content organized? Is there a specific method of organization, and will the audience, will they understand the material based on the organization that you as the writer provided? So when we think about it, let's say that, again, you live in St. George and you say, well, we don't really have the resources necessary to combat or to account for flash flooding when it happens. We need more resources. We need better methods in place just in case it does happen again. So let's say you want to write a letter to the St. George City Council. You want to ask yourself to say, okay, well, if I am making the argument that flash floods have grown in intensity over the past 20 years, maybe that's a section of the piece that you're writing to them. You want to ask yourself, okay, would they prefer that I talk about this chronologically? To say, okay, well, in 2001, we saw this number of flash floods, and this was the property damage done. These are some stories that accompany that. In 2003, this was the number of flash floods. This is the amount of property damage done, and so on and so on. And then you approach that chronologically to say, all right, we're going to start in 2000. We're going to go all the way to 2019. So that could be a preferred method of organization. Or maybe you say, okay, well, they are really concerned less about the chronology and more about the human impact it has. So maybe you could say, okay, well, I can organize my content to say, let's find stories about about property damage, about what people lost during flash floods, and we will organize it going from the most intense stories to the least intense stories to illustrate the point. So those are two very different methods of organization that you could use. You still might use very much the same content, but the way in which you present it to the reader needs to be taken into consideration to say, okay, well, how can I present this content in a way that is palatable to my readers and ultimately persuasive to them? All right, finally, what you want to do is you want to review your transitions. So how you basically get from one point to the next, paragraph wise. So I recommend with transitions to have an old information, new information structure. So for example, if you are ending your section on logos for project one, you basically want to have some kind of sentence in there that says, all right, I have talked about logos, old information. I have talked about how the writer used numbers in this way, and this way, but let's talk now about the emotions that are associated with those numbers by looking at pathos. So we've got old information, new information. You have said to the audience, I just talked a lot about logos, and now I'm going to talk a lot about pathos. And so we've got that transition that prepares the reader to shift gears and look at one content focus to look at another content focus. So this ensures that you've connected each idea also back to the purpose of your writing and emphasizes the connection between supporting ideas. So when we think about it in that way, it basically, when we focus on our transitions, that gives us the opportunity to say, hey, this is how I, as the writer, see point A being connected to point B. And this is how them working together ultimately ties back to whatever purpose I've identified for my writing. Let's now look at the lecture assignment. Review your Project 1 rough draft and compose a brief write-up identifying the purpose of your writing. So think about, why are you writing a rhetorical analysis on the artifact that you are? And that should be about 50 words. Your write-up will also determine the purpose of each paragraph and justify its place in your writing. And that should be about 25 words per paragraph. So this is where you say, okay, this paragraph provides the context for the piece. And this paragraph introduces the audience to how the author uses pathos. So you want to be aware of What does this paragraph do? Why is it here? What purpose does it fulfill? And what does it do that the other paragraphs don't? And your write-up will also identify your audience and justify your organization with them in mind. So you say, okay, well, I decided to organize my analysis by first providing an introduction and then looking at the context, then talking about the audience, and then focusing on the appeals, because I felt it important to identify the audience first as opposed to waiting toward the end. So these are going to change from one person to the next, but this should really be an opportunity to reflect on the writing that you have and to say, okay, based on how it's organized, based on how I'm presenting my ideas, do I get that point across? Do I achieve my purpose that I have set out for this piece? Okay, so for the weekly homework, you'll want to include your core lecture 6 summary and assignment in your week 3 homework submission. Overall, your week 3 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for core lectures 5 and 6, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. You'll want to submit all of this to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 8th. If you have any questions or if there's content that you'd like to chat about in greater detail, please feel free to message me on Canvas. All right, everyone, until next time.